Paris, 1821. The city was still finding its footing after the Napoleonic whirlwind and the subsequent Bourbon Restoration. Within this complex urban tapestry, in the heart of the intellectual Latin Quarter at 13 Rue Hautefeuille, Charles-Pierre Baudelaire was born on April 9th. He was the only child of a rather unusual union. His father, Joseph-François Baudelaire, was already 62 years old, a man whose life had spanned vastly different eras and vocations. Originally trained for the priesthood, Joseph-François had abandoned his clerical path during the seismic shifts of the French Revolution in 1793. He transitioned into the civil service, eventually achieving a comfortable position, likely within the administration of the Senate. Beyond his bureaucratic duties, he possessed a genuine, if modest, artistic sensibility, dabbling in both painting and poetry. It was this artistic inclination, this engagement with the visual, that Baudelaire later credited with instilling in him an early fascination with images, a foundational element of his later aesthetic theories. Charles's mother, Caroline Archimbaud Dufay, presented a stark contrast in age, being only 27 at the time of his birth. She was Joseph-François' second wife, married to him just 2 years earlier in 1819. Little is recorded about her life before this marriage, but she brought youth and perhaps a different kind of sensibility into the elderly civil servant's household. The significant age gap between his parents created a unique family dynamic, positioning Charles as the child of his father's old age. This configuration was dramatically altered on February 10, 1827. Joseph-François died, leaving Caroline a widow and Charles, not yet 6 years old, fatherless. The 18 months that followed were, in Baudelaire's later, perhaps idealized memory, a period of intense, almost suffocating intimacy with his mother. Living alone together, their bond deepened, creating what he recalled as a time of exclusive devotion, a lost paradise of maternal love. This perception, whether entirely accurate or retrospectively embellished, highlights the profound significance of the maternal figure in Baudelaire's emotional development. The perceived idyll shattered on November 8, 1828, when Caroline remarried. Her choice was Jacques Opic, 40 years old, an ambitious and disciplined career soldier holding the rank of major, though destined for much higher command and diplomatic postings. For Caroline, the marriage likely offered security and social stability. For Charles, however, it felt like a profound act of betrayal. The arrival of Opic, a figure embodying military rigidity and conventional success, everything the burgeoning poet would come to despise, shattered the exclusive bond with his mother. This perceived usurpation ignited a deep and lasting resentment towards his stepfather, casting a pall over his childhood and adolescence, and establishing a pattern of conflict with authority figures that would mark his entire life. The presence of Jacques Opic fundamentally altered the course of Baudelaire's young life, not least geographically. In 1831, Opic's military career necessitated a move from the familiar streets of Paris to the provincial city of Lyons. This relocation, occurring when Charles was around 10 years old, further distanced him from the Parisian milieu of his birth. The following year, 1832, marked another significant separation. He was enrolled as a boarder at the Collège Royal in Lyons. Boarding school life, with its regimented routines and communal living, likely exacerbated the feelings of alienation and loss stemming from his father's death and his mother's remarriage. He was now physically removed from his mother for extended periods, a situation compounded by his growing dislike for the man who now headed the household. 4 years later, in 1836, the family returned to Paris as Opic's career continued its ascent. Charles, now 15, was transferred to the prestigious Lycée Louis-le-Grand, one of Paris's most esteemed secondary schools, again entering as a boarder. While the lycée offered a high standard of classical education, Baudelaire's experience there was far from smooth. Academically, he demonstrated flashes of brilliance, particularly in literature and classics, but his overall record was inconsistent. More concerning to his masters were his personality and demeanor. He was noted for a precocious melancholy, a tendency towards introspection and moodiness that seemed out of step with his peers. He was also perceived as cultivating certain affectations unsuited to his age, perhaps early signs of the dandyism and deliberate cultivation of an outsider persona that would later define him. He chafed against the school's discipline, his relationship with authority figures already strained by his conflict with Orpik. This tension culminated in April 1839, when, just months before he was due to complete his studies, Baudelaire was expelled. The catalyst was a minor infraction, refusing to divulge the name of a classmate who had passed him a note. But his defiance in the face of questioning sealed his fate. It was an early instance of the rebellious pride and refusal to conform that would characterize much of his life. Despite this ignominious end to his time at Louis le Grand, Baudelaire possessed the intellectual capacity to succeed academically when he chose. After a period of study at the less prestigious Collège Saint-Louis, he sat for and successfully passed the rigorous baccalaureate examination in August 1839. This qualification marked the end of his formal secondary schooling and opened the door to higher education, or at least the semblance of it. The years immediately following the baccalaureate, roughly 1839 to 1841, were pivotal. Officially, Baudelaire enrolled as a law student at the École de Droit in Paris, likely to placate his family. In reality, his true life unfolded far from the lecture halls, amidst the vibrant, impoverished, and intellectually stimulating chaos of the Latin Quarter. He plunged into the bohemian world, frequenting cafes, associating with aspiring writers and artists, and forging his first real literary friendships with figures like Gustave Le Vavasseur and Ernest Prarand. He began writing poetry with greater seriousness, experimenting with his voice and themes. This period offered intellectual freedom and camaraderie, but also significant dangers. Baudelaire lived irregularly, neglected his nominal studies, and began accumulating debts, borrowing money to sustain a lifestyle beyond his limited allowance. It was during this phase of youthful experimentation and disregard for convention that he also suffered a life-altering consequence. He contracted syphilis, most likely from a prostitute known only as Sarah Lalouchette. This incurable disease, shrouded in shame and poorly managed by 19th-century medicine, would cast a long, dark shadow over his future health, contributing to decades of physical suffering and ultimately his premature death. Baudelaire's dissolute life in the Latin Quarter, the debts, the bohemian companions, the alarming diagnosis of syphilis, pushed his family to act decisively. General Orpik, embodying conventional discipline, and Caroline, perhaps torn but ultimately concurring, saw a long sea voyage as the only solution. Their plan, conceived in the spring of 1841, was twofold. Remove Charles from the temptations of Paris and instill some sense of order through the rigors of maritime life, hoping the journey to Calcutta might broaden his horizons or even spark an interest in a respectable career in colonial trade. On June 9, 1841, the 20-year-old Baudelaire, likely protesting vehemently but ultimately powerless against his family's decision backed by legal authority, was escorted aboard the paquebot des Mers du Sud. The voyage was framed as an educational opportunity, but for Baudelaire, it felt like deportation. Life aboard the ship did little to change his perspective. He found the routine monotonous, the society of merchants and colonial officials tedious, and the enforced proximity unbearable. Yet the journey itself, the vastness of the ocean, the changing skies, the encounters with different climates and cultures began to seep into his consciousness. The long days at sea provided ample time for reflection, observation, and perhaps the gestation of poetic ideas. When the ship reached the Mascarene Islands in the Indian Ocean in September 1841, Baudelaire seized his chance. Arriving in Port Louis, Mauritius, he refused to travel further. Whether through sheer obstinacy, feigned illness, or persuasive charm, he convinced the captain to allow him to disembark. He spent several weeks on Mauritius and then travelled to the neighbouring Île Bourbon, now Réunion. Here, far from the grey skies and intellectual confines of Paris, he encountered a world of vibrant colour, exotic vegetation, intense heat, and a different rhythm of life. He absorbed the sensory richness of the tropics, the scent of spices, the sight of unfamiliar landscapes, the languor of colonial society. Though his stay was relatively short, these islands became a potent symbol in his imagination, a lost paradise of sensual beauty and exoticism that he would later evoke with powerful nostalgia in poems like À une dame créole, dedicated to Madame Otard de Braga, whom he met in Mauritius, and the lush imagery found in pieces exploring memory and escape. Having successfully curtailed his prescribed journey, Baudelaire secured passage back to France. He landed in Bordeaux on February 15, 1842. His perspective perhaps subtly altered, his store of imagery enriched, but his fundamental character and conflicts largely unchanged. Awaiting him was a significant milestone, his 21st birthday in April 1842. This meant he finally attained legal majority and, crucially, gained access to the substantial inheritance left to him by his father, Joseph François. Suddenly possessed of a fortune amounting to somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 francs, a very considerable sum at the time, Baudelaire was free from Orpic's direct control and financially equipped to live exactly as he pleased. He immediately embraced this freedom with defiant extravagance. Rejecting any notion of prudence or investment, he dedicated himself wholeheartedly to the art of living, specifically the carefully cultivated life of the Parisian dandy. He took up residence on the fashionable Île Saint-Louis, initially at the Hôtel Corneille, and later, famously, at the Hôtel Pimodon, Hôtel de Lausanne, at 17 Quai d'Anjou. This historic building was not only architecturally splendid, but also housed the infamous Club des Hachichins, a loose gathering of writers and artists, including Théophile Gautier, who met periodically to experiment with hashish under the supervision of Dr. Jacques-Joseph Moreau de Tours. Baudelaire participated in these sessions between 1843 and 1845, meticulously documenting the sensory distortions and psychological effects, experiences that would inform Les Paradis Artificiels. His dandyism extended to meticulous attention to his appearance, bespoke clothing from expensive tailors, carefully chosen accessories, and the curation of his surroundings. He filled his apartments with fine furniture, paintings, rare books, and objets d'art, creating an environment dedicated to aesthetic pleasure. He spent prodigiously on fine dining, expensive wines, and entertaining, quickly attracting attention in artistic and bohemian circles for his refined taste, his provocative conversation, and his apparent wealth. This period of lavish spending coincided with the beginning of the most significant romantic relationship of his life. Shortly after his return in 1842, he met Jeanne Duval. Details of their first encounter are obscure, but Duval, an actress and dancer of striking appearance and likely Haitian ancestry, immediately captivated him. She became his mistress, the embodiment of an exotic, sensual beauty far removed from bourgeois convention. Their relationship, however, was intensely volatile from the start, marked by passion, jealousy, financial dependence. Duval quickly became reliant on Baudelaire's generosity and frequent conflict. She became his Vénus Noire, inspiring poems that explored the complex interplay of love and hate, ecstasy and anguish, beauty and decay. While providing profound poetic inspiration, The relationship with Duval also proved to be a significant drain on his rapidly dwindling resources and a source of constant emotional turmoil. The whirlwind of extravagant living fueled by Baudelaire's inheritance could not last. By the summer of 1844, barely 2 years after receiving his fortune, the alarming truth became undeniable. He had already spent nearly half of it. His lavish lifestyle, combined with the financial demands of his relationship with Jeanne Duval and perhaps unwise loans taken out at exorbitant interest rates from unscrupulous moneylenders, had led him to the brink of ruin. Faced with the prospect of their son and stepson completely squandering his patrimony, Caroline and General Orpik felt compelled to intervene legally. On September 21, 1844, their petition was granted, and Baudelaire was officially placed under a conseil judiciaire. This legal mechanism, typically applied to prodigals and those deemed incapable of managing their own affairs, appointed a guardian. In Baudelaire's case, the family notary, Maître Narcisse Ancel, to control his remaining capital. From this point forward, Baudelaire lost direct access to his inheritance. He was reduced to receiving a small monthly allowance, meticulously doled out by Ancel, an amount barely sufficient for basic necessities, let alone the dandyish lifestyle he craved. This arrangement, which persisted for the rest of his life, was a source of profound humiliation and constant frustration. It forced him into a perpetual state of financial anxiety, endless negotiations with Ancel for small advances, and a simmering resentment towards his family, whom he saw as having infantilized him and curtailed his freedom. The conseil judiciaire became a central, defining constraint of his adult existence. This enforced austerity, however, may have inadvertently spurred his literary ambitions. Denied the means to live purely as an aesthete, Baudelaire increasingly looked to writing not just for fame but also for income. While poetry remained his ultimate goal, the path to recognition and payment often lay through journalism and criticism. He threw himself into art criticism with renewed vigor, building on the aesthetic principles he had been developing. His review of the official art exhibition of 1845, the Salon de 1845, published as a pamphlet, caused a stir. It was notable for its passionate, subjective judgments, its dismissal of academic convention, and its fervent championing of Eugène Delacroix, whom Baudelaire saw as the embodiment of romantic passion and modern artistic sensibility. He followed this success with the even more influential Salon de 1846. Here, he articulated his groundbreaking theory of the heroism of modern life, urging artists to turn away from classical or historical subjects and instead find beauty and significance in the fleeting realities of contemporary Paris, its crowds, its fashions, its contrasts of luxury and poverty. He called for a painter who could capture the transitory, the fugitive, the contingent, which he saw as one half of art, the other being the eternal and the immutable. These salons established Baudelaire as a formidable critical voice, one whose insights transcended mere description to engage with the fundamental questions of art's role in modernity. His poetic work continued alongside his criticism, though publication remained sporadic. He composed many of the poems that would later form the bedrock of Les Fleurs du Mal, exploring themes of love, death, urban alienation, and the conflict between spiritual yearning, ideal, and crushing despair, spleen. He conceived of ambitious, thematically unified collections, announcing his intention to publish a volume titled Les Lesbiennes around 1845, reflecting his interest in unconventional forms of love, and later planning a collection called Les Limbes, Limbo, intended, as he wrote, to represent the agitations and melancholies of modern youth. While these specific titles were ultimately abandoned, the underlying concepts shaped the eventual structure of Les Fleurs du Mal. His primary creative publication during this period was his only novella, La Fanfalo, which appeared in January 1847. This intriguing, somewhat autobiographical work tells the story of Samuel Kramer, a poet and dandy torn between his idealized love for a respectable married woman and his sensual entanglement with the titular Fan Farlow, an exotic dancer. The novella offers a complex, often ironic self-portrait, exploring themes of dandyism as performance, the relationship between artifice and emotion, and the poet's ambivalent relationship with women. It showcased Baudelaire's skill with prose and his capacity for psychological nuance, even as it hinted at his own personal conflicts. His personal life remained tumultuous. While the demanding relationship with Jeanne Duval continued, it was punctuated by other involvements. He had a significant but relatively brief affair with the actress Marie Daubrun around 1847, a relationship that inspired a different cycle of poems, often characterized by themes of escape, idealized beauty, and treacherous allure, perhaps influencing poems like Chant d'automne or L'invitation au voyage. Simultaneously, he developed a complex, largely epistolary relationship with Apollonie Sabatier, a wealthy, intelligent courtesan whose popular salon was a meeting place for artists and writers. Known affectionately as La Présidente, Sabatier became the object of Baudelaire's idealized devotion. For several years, he sent her anonymous poems expressing worshipful admiration, placing her on a pedestal as a muse of spiritual beauty, a stark contrast to the dark sensuality associated with Duval. These different relationships reflect the fragmented and often contradictory nature of Baudelaire's emotional and erotic life during this formative period. The year 1848 brought revolutionary upheaval across Europe, and Paris was once again at its epicenter. In February, widespread discontent with the conservative policies and perceived corruption of King Louis Philippe's July monarchy boiled over into open revolt. Barricades sprang up across the city, and after several days of intense street fighting, the king abdicated, leading to the proclamation of the Second Republic. For Charles Baudelaire, the aesthete seemingly preoccupied with art, poetry, and personal anxieties, this political earthquake prompted a surprising and fervent engagement. Shedding his dandyish persona, he actively participated in the February Revolution. Eyewitness accounts, including those of his friends like Charles Tubin, place him on the barricades, armed and impassioned. His motivations were likely a potent mix: a genuine belief in republican ideals, a visceral hatred for the bourgeois order represented by Louis Philippe and perhaps projected onto his stepfather, the newly promoted General Orpik, and an attraction to the sheer drama and destructive energy of the uprising. The famous, though possibly embellished, story of him shouting for insurgents to go and shoot General Orpik captures the intensity of his feelings, blending personal animosity with revolutionary zeal. In the immediate aftermath of the February Revolution, Baudelaire embraced radical politics. He briefly launched himself into revolutionary journalism, co-founding a short-lived, ephemeral newspaper titled Le Salut Public with the writer Champfleury and Tubin. Baudelaire reportedly contributed fiery articles, adopting the rhetoric of the far left. His political sympathies during this period seem to have leaned towards the socialist and perhaps even anarchist tendencies represented by figures like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, emphasizing individual liberty and opposing centralized authority, whether monarchical or bourgeois republican. This radical stance placed him firmly on the side of the working classes, when tensions flared again just a few months later. The provisional government established after February quickly proved too conservative for the Parisian workers who had spearheaded the revolution. When the government announced the closure of the national workshops, created to provide work for the unemployed, it sparked another massive insurrection in June 1848, known as the June Days Uprising. This was a brutal class conflict, pitting the workers against the forces of the Republic, led by General Cavaignac. Baudelaire, consistent with his earlier revolutionary fervor, appears to have sided with the insurgents, participating in the desperate and ultimately doomed struggle on the barricades. The bloody suppression of the June Days, with thousands killed or deported, marked a decisive conservative turn in the Second Republic and likely contributed to Baudelaire's growing political disillusionment. His final significant foray into active politics came in response to Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte's coup d'état on December 2, 1851. Louis Napoleon, elected President of the Republic largely on the strength of his famous name, overthrew the constitution to seize absolute power, paving the way for his declaration as Emperor Napoleon III the following year. Baudelaire joined the limited and quickly suppressed street resistance against the coup. The ease with which the Republic was dismantled and an authoritarian regime established seems to have profoundly disheartened him. He later claimed that the events of December 1851 marked the definitive end of his active political engagement. Witnessing the triumph of military force and the apparent apathy of the populace convinced him, he suggested, of the futility of direct political struggle for an artist. Henceforth, he would retreat into his work, declaring that under a military dictatorship, the only dignified response for a man of letters was literature itself. While he never entirely lost his critical perspective on society and power, the brief, intense period of Baudelaire, the active revolutionary, was over, replaced by the more enduring figure of Baudelaire, the alienated observer and chronicler of modern life. Having turned his back on direct political action after Louis Napoleon's 1851 coup, Baudelaire retreated into the realm where he felt he could make a more lasting impact: literature. The period from 1852 to 1857 was marked by intense intellectual labor, primarily focused on translation, criticism, and the painstaking assembly of his own poetic work. Central to this phase was his profound and almost obsessive engagement with Edgar Allan Poe. Baudelaire had encountered Poe's stories and poems around 1847, likely through translations or articles in French journals. He experienced an electrifying shock of recognition, seeing in the American writer a reflection of his own obsessions. The exploration of psychological extremes, the fascination with the grotesque and the arabesque, the pursuit of beauty in unconventional forms, the figure of the misunderstood artist struggling against a hostile or indifferent society. He famously declared, "The first time I opened a book by him, I saw with terror and delight not only subjects I had dreamt of, but sentences I had thought and which he had written 20 years before." This sense of profound kinship fueled a monumental translation project. Baudelaire dedicated himself to rendering Poe's works into French with unparalleled stylistic fidelity and empathetic understanding. This was not merely a commercial task. It was an act of devotion, a way of championing a fellow artistic soul whom he believed had been unjustly neglected, particularly in America. Starting in the early 1850s, he meticulously translated Poe's tales, essays, and poems, publishing them serially in journals before collecting them into volumes. The first major collection, Histoires extraordinaires, Extraordinary Stories, appeared in 1856, followed by Nouvelles Histoires extraordinaires in 1857, and later Aventures d'Arthur Gordon Pym, Eureka, and Histoire grotesque et sérieuse. Baudelaire's translations were widely acclaimed for their literary quality, effectively creating Poe's reputation as a major writer in France and continental Europe, an influence that would resonate through symbolism and beyond. This demanding work provided Baudelaire with a modest but necessary income stream, while also allowing him to immerse himself in an aesthetic universe closely aligned with his own. Simultaneously, Baudelaire continued to hone his skills as a critic. He published essays on contemporary art, notably reviewing the Exposition Universelle of 1855, where he again championed Delacroix and offered sharp critiques of other artists. He also wrote perceptively on caricature, analyzing the social commentary embedded in the works of Daumier and Gavarni. His intellectual curiosity extended to the effects of intoxicants, building upon his earlier essay Du vin et du hashish. He gathered his reflections, informed by personal experience but increasingly critical of the illusory nature of drug-induced states, for the book Les Paradis Artificiels, which would appear in 1860. These critical writings, diverse in subject matter, consistently showcased Baudelaire's unique perspective. His ability to connect aesthetic phenomena to broader cultural and psychological concerns, and his mastery of evocative prose. All this time, the slow, arduous process of creating and refining his own poetry continued. He worked meticulously, constantly revising and polishing his verses. Individual poems began to appear more frequently in literary reviews, such as L'Artiste and Revue de Paris, giving the public glimpses of his unique and often unsettling poetic world. By 1855, he felt ready to present a more substantial selection. He submitted a group of 18 poems to the highly respected, somewhat conservative Revue des Deux Mondes. Published in the June 1st issue under the title Les Fleurs du Mal, this selection served as a significant preview of the forthcoming collection, introducing his challenging themes and distinctive style to a wider, more mainstream audience, and likely testing the waters for the reception of the full volume. Finally, after years of composition, revision, and negotiation with publishers, the first edition of Les Fleurs du Mal was published on June 25, 1857, though some sources cite June 21st or 23rd. His chosen publishers were Auguste Poulet-Malassis and Eugène de Broise, known for their willingness to handle potentially controversial works. The volume contained 100 poems, carefully arranged by Baudelaire himself into 5 thematic sections: Spleen et idéal, Fleurs du Mal, Révolte, Le Vin, and La Mort. This structure was integral to the work's meaning, charting a course through the poet's experience of modern life, from the depths of despair and urban alienation to fleeting moments of beauty, revolt against convention, artificial escapes, and the final confrontation with mortality. The title itself, The Flowers of Evil, was deliberately paradoxical, suggesting the possibility of extracting beauty from suffering, sin, and decay, a central tenet of Baudelaire's aesthetic. The reaction was immediate and polarized. While some critics recognized the book's originality and power, the dominant response, particularly in the official press aligned with the moral conservatism of Napoleon III's Second Empire, was outrage. The poem's explicit sensuality, their exploration of taboo subjects like lesbian love and vampirism, their perceived morbidity, and their questioning of religious and social norms were deemed scandalous. Less than 2 weeks after publication, on July the 7th, the Ministry of the Interior initiated legal action. On August the 20th, 1857, Baudelaire and his publishers stood trial before the 6th Correctional Chamber of the Seine Tribunal, charged with outrage à la morale publique et aux bonnes mœurs, offense against public morality and good morals. The charge of offending religious morality was dropped. Baudelaire's lawyer, Gustave Chaise d'Estanges, argued eloquently for the book's artistic integrity, but the court remained unconvinced. Baudelaire was found guilty, fined 300 francs, a sum later reduced to 50 francs following an appeal supported by Empress Eugénie, and, most damagingly, ordered to remove 6 specific poems from any future editions. These condemned poems, Lesbos, Femme damnée, Delphine et Hippolyte, Le L'été, À celle qui est trop gaie, Les bijoux, and Les métamorphoses du vampire, became notorious symbols of the censorship Baudelaire faced. The trial, while a personal and financial setback, cemented Les Fleurs du Mal's status as a succès de scandale, ensuring its place in literary history as a work that dared to confront the darker realities of the modern soul. The aftermath of the 1857 trial brought Baudelaire notoriety, but little financial relief or personal peace. The fine, though eventually reduced, added to his mountain of debt, and the condemnation of his work deepened his sense of alienation from mainstream society. The years following the trial, leading into the early 1860s, were a continuation of the patterns established earlier. A relentless struggle against poverty, exacerbated by the constraints of the Conseil judiciaire and his own inability to manage money. Recurring bouts of debilitating illness as the tertiary stage of syphilis began to manifest more severe neurological and physical symptoms. And the pervasive grip of spleen, those agonizing periods of depression, creative paralysis, and profound existential despair. His relationship with his mother, Caroline, entered a new phase following the death of General Aupic in April 1857, just before the Fleurs du Mal trial. While the primary source of Baudelaire's resentment was removed, their interactions remained complex. Caroline moved to Honfleur on the Normandy coast, and Baudelaire visited her there periodically, finding temporary refuge. There were moments of tenderness and shared grief, particularly as Caroline herself aged and faced loneliness. However, fundamental tensions persisted, often revolving around money. Baudelaire's constant requests for funds, Caroline's anxieties about his lifestyle, and her enduring inability to fully comprehend or approve of his literary path. Their correspondence reveals a painful dynamic of mutual dependence, misunderstanding, and frustrated love. Despite these immense personal challenges, Baudelaire's intellectual life remained vibrant. He produced some of his most important critical essays during this period. In 1859, he published a long, appreciative study of the poet Théophile Gautier, to whom he had dedicated Les Fleurs du Mal, praising Gautier's formal perfection and commitment to art for art's sake. In 1861, he wrote passionately about the German composer Richard Wagner, defending his controversial opera Tannhäuser after its disastrous Paris premiere, and hailing Wagner as a kindred spirit in the pursuit of a modern, synthetic art form. Perhaps his most influential critical work from this era was Le Peintre de la Vie Moderne, The Painter of Modern Life. Although written mostly between 1859 and 1860, it wasn't published until 1863 in the newspaper Le Figaro. Using the relatively minor illustrator Constantin Guise as his central example, Baudelaire brilliantly articulated his theory of modernity, defining it as the transient, the fleeting, the contingent, and celebrating the artist who could capture the unique beauty and strangeness of contemporary urban experience. He also completed and published Les Paradis Artificiels in 1860, offering his mature reflections on the illusory nature of drug-induced experiences compared to the more authentic intoxication derived from art and wine. His poetic focus also evolved. Following the partial suppression of the first edition of Les Fleurs du Mal, Baudelaire immediately began planning a revised and augmented version. Working again with his dedicated publisher Poulet-Malassis, the second edition appeared in February 1861. It was a significant reworking. Baudelaire removed the 6 condemned poems, but added 35 new ones, bringing the total to 129. He also restructured the collection, most notably adding the entirely new section Tableaux Parisiens. This section contained 18 poems, many newly composed, that focused explicitly on the landscapes and inhabitants of modern Paris, capturing its beauty, squalor, crowds, and solitude with unprecedented power. Poems like Le Cygne, The Swan, Les Sept Vieillards, The Seven Old Men, and Les Petites Vieilles, The Little Old Women, exemplified his ability to find poetic resonance in the most mundane or unsettling aspects of urban life. This second edition, with its expanded scope and refined structure, is generally considered the definitive version of Les Fleurs du Mal. In a curious episode spanning late 1861 and early 1862, Baudelaire allowed his name to be put forward for election to the Académie Française, the august body representing the pinnacle of French literary establishment. Given his anti-establishment stance and controversial reputation, this candidacy was met with surprise and some ridicule. While he secured a few supportive votes, the effort was ultimately unsuccessful. his motives remain debated. Perhaps a genuine, if naive, desire for official recognition, on a calculated act of provocation, or a desperate attempt to improve his financial prospects. Alongside revising his verse collection, Baudelaire increasingly turned his attention to a new form: the prose poem. He sought a poetic language suited to the fragmented, dissonant experiences of modern city life. A poetic prose, musical without rhythm and without rhyme, supple enough and rugged enough to adapt itself to the lyrical impulses of the soul, the undulations of reverie, the leaps and bounds of consciousness. Starting in the late 1850s, he began publishing these short, evocative pieces in various journals. These petits poèmes en prose, later collected posthumously as Le Spleen de Paris, explored urban encounters, fleeting moments of beauty or horror, social satire, and philosophical reflections, demonstrating remarkable formal freedom and influencing generations of later poets. By 1864, however, Baudelaire's situation in Paris had become untenable. Hounded by creditors and desperate for a change of fortune, he accepted invitations to give a series of lectures in Belgium. He travelled to Brussels in April, hoping the lectures would be profitable and that he might find a Belgian publisher willing to issue his complete works, including the suppressed poems. The Belgian venture turned into an unmitigated disaster. His lectures on art and literature were poorly attended and met with incomprehension or indifference. Publishing negotiations stalled. He found Belgian society provincial, materialistic, and deeply uncongenial. Venting his spleen in vitriolic notes, later published as Pauvre Belgique, Poor Belgium. Trapped by lack of funds, and perhaps a paralyzing inertia, he remained in Brussels for nearly 2 years, sinking deeper into debt, isolation, and ill health. The physical symptoms of his syphilis worsened: chronic fatigue, digestive problems, possibly early neurological signs. His reliance on laudanum, tincture of opium, likely increased. In March 1866, while visiting the Baroque church of Saint-Lô in Namur with his friend Félicien Rops, Baudelaire suddenly collapsed. He had suffered a massive stroke, resulting in severe aphasia, loss of speech, and right-sided paralysis, hemiplegia. At the age of 45, his literary voice was silenced and the final tragic chapter of his life began. The stroke that felled Baudelaire in Namur in March 1866 was catastrophic and irreversible. It left him with severe aphasia, robbing him of the ability to speak coherently, though his comprehension remained largely intact. He also suffered from hemiplegia, paralyzing his right side. After initial care in Brussels, his devoted mother, Caroline Orpik, arranged for his transfer back to Paris in early July 1866. He was admitted to a specialized clinic, the Maison du Bois, run by Dr. Émile Duval, located in the Chaillot district at 1 Rue de Dôme. This would be his final residence. For the next 13 months, Baudelaire lived in a state of profound dependency and near total silence. His existence became a slow, agonizing decline, a living entombment. While mentally aware, capable of recognizing visitors, expressing emotions like anger or affection through gestures, and understanding spoken language, he was trapped, unable to articulate the complex thoughts surely still forming within his mind. His vocabulary was reduced to a single, often repeated expletive, crénom, a contraction of Sacré nom de Dieu, a heartbreakingly inadequate tool for the master linguist. His physical condition steadily deteriorated under the relentless progression of neurosyphilis. Madame Orpik was his most constant visitor and caregiver, spending hours by his bedside nearly every day. Their relationship, fraught with tension for decades, found a tragic, quiet resolution in these final months, defined by maternal devotion and filial helplessness. A small circle of loyal friends also paid visits, offering what comfort they could. Figures like the publisher Auguste Poulet-Malassis, despite Baudelaire owing him considerable sums. The photographer Nadar, the critic Sainte-Beuve, who had often clashed with Baudelaire critically but recognized his genius. And Asselineau, his future biographer, came to witness the slow dimming of this extraordinary intellect. Jeanne Duval, herself ill and impoverished, reportedly visited him at least once, a final poignant encounter between the poet and his dark muse. Throughout this period, Baudelaire remained acutely aware of his condition, often displaying intense frustration at his inability to communicate. There were moments of lucidity, recognition, and emotional response, but the overall trajectory was one of fading consciousness and physical decay. On August 31st, 1867, after more than a year in the clinic, Charles Baudelaire died peacefully, likely from complications related to his syphilis. He was 46 years old. His funeral, held on September 2nd at the nearby church of Saint-Honoré-des-Laux, was a modest affair. Perhaps fewer than 100 people attended, a mix of literary figures, including Paul Verlaine and Stéphane Mallarmé, representing the younger generation already influenced by him, loyal friends and family acquaintances. The official eulogies were brief and somewhat reserved, reflecting his controversial status. He was buried later that day in the Montparnasse cemetery. In a final, bitter irony, his remains were placed not in a grave bearing his own name, but in the Orpic family vault, alongside his mother and the stepfather he had so profoundly resented. In the years immediately following his death, Baudelaire's literary executors, primarily Charles Asselineau and Théodore de Banville, worked to secure his legacy. A third, more complete edition of Les Fleurs du Mal, including previously unpublished poems and juvenilia, was published in 1868 with a preface by Théophile Gautier. Perhaps most importantly, the collection of prose poems Baudelaire had meticulously crafted over many years finally appeared in book form in 1869, edited by his executors under the title Le Spleen de Paris, though Baudelaire himself had preferred petits poèmes en prose. His extensive critical writings were also gathered and published in volumes like Curiosités esthétiques, 1868, and L'Art romantique, 1869, showcasing the breadth and depth of his insights into painting, literature, music, and modern culture. Later, his intimate, often revealing journals, Fusée, Mon cœur mis à nu, and his voluminous correspondence were published, offering invaluable perspectives on his life, thought, and creative process. While misunderstood and condemned by many during his lifetime, Baudelaire's influence grew exponentially after his death. The symbolist poets of the late 19th century, Verlaine, Mallarmé, Rimbaud, explicitly claimed him as their master, recognizing his pioneering exploration of suggestion, synesthesia, and the hidden correspondences between the material and spiritual worlds. His unflinching portrayal of urban modernity, his fusion of high lyricism with base subject matter, his formal innovations in both verse and prose, and his profound psychological insight resonated deeply with subsequent generations of writers and artists across Europe and beyond. The ban on the 6 condemned poems from Les Fleurs du Mal remained a legal reality for nearly a century, a testament to their enduring power to shock until it was finally overturned by the Cour de Cassation in France on May 31, 1949, formally rehabilitating the work. Today, Charles Baudelaire stands as arguably the most important poet of the 19th century, a crucial bridge between Romanticism and modernism, whose dark, complex, and exquisitely crafted works continue to define our understanding of the modern condition.